"Mom, you need to clear out." The words sliced through the quiet afternoon air, sharp and unfeeling. I looked up from the book I was reading, my finger still marking the page. My son, Ethan, stood in the doorway of my bedroom. He wasn't looking at me, but at the walls, the furniture, the space, as if I were already gone. "Chloe's TikTok is getting serious," he continued, his tone flat, matter-of-fact. "She needs a proper studio." Behind him, his wife, Sarah, stood with her arms crossed, a mask of impatient pity on her face. Her gaze flickered over me, a brief, dismissive assessment. It was she who delivered the final, sterile blow. "We've cleared a space for your things in the basement storage. It's perfectly dry." My bedroom. The words echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. This room had been my sanctuary for the 5 years since I'd moved in, the only space in this cavernous Irvine house that felt like mine. It was where the morning sun would spill across the floorboards, where I kept the last photograph of my husband, Richard, on the nightstand. It was the room he and I had picked out on the blueprints, the one with the view of the jacaranda tree in the backyard. The room Ethan had promised would be mine, always. "A studio?" I finally managed to whisper. The word felt foreign, absurd. Ethan sighed, a sound of profound annoyance, as if my confusion were a personal inconvenience. "Yes, a studio, with a ring light and backdrops. You wouldn't understand, Mom. It's her career." Career. My granddaughter, a bubbly 16-year-old, had a career that required evicting me from my life. Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor of the hallway. She wouldn't cross the threshold into my room. "It's a huge opportunity for her, Ava. A brand wants to sponsor her. We can't have her filming in the living room anymore." "It's unprofessional." I looked from my son's averted face to my daughter-in-law's polished, unyielding one. I saw no room for negotiation. This wasn't a discussion. It was a decree. The decision had been made in conversations I was not a part of, in a world where my comfort was a lower priority than a teenager's online validation. "The basement?" I repeated, the words tasting like dust. I remembered the basement. It was where the holiday decorations were stored in plastic tubs, where a broken treadmill gathered cobwebs. It smelled of damp concrete and something vaguely chemical. "It's not so bad," Ethan said, finally meeting my eyes for a fraction of a second before looking away again. "We put a rug down, and there's a new cot. It'll be cozy." Cozy, a word used to describe a warm fire, a soft blanket, not a concrete tomb. I felt a coldness spread from my chest outwards, a creeping paralysis. I wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice, to remind him of his promises, of the $500,000 I had given him from the sale of my Carmel home to buy this oversized monument to his success, the home I was supposed to be a part of, not a resident of its underbelly. But my throat was tight, my voice a traitor. The shock had stolen my words, leaving only a hollow, vibrating ache. They left me then, standing in the doorway of a room that was no longer mine. I could hear Chloe's excited chatter from downstairs, the sound of her laughing as she discussed camera angles with Sarah. I was a ghost in my own home, a problem being tidied away. I walked over to the nightstand and picked up the silver frame holding Richard's picture. He was smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners, the California sun behind him. We were on the porch of our little house in Carmel, the one that smelled of sea salt and roses. "You'll never be alone, Ava," Ethan had said to me after Richard's funeral, his arm around my shoulder. "We're a family. We'll take care of you." I began to pack. It was a slow, methodical process, each item a small death. The worn copy of East of Eden Richard had given me on our 10th anniversary. My collection of hand-painted ceramic birds. The soft cashmere shawl I wore in the evenings. I wrapped each piece in newspaper and placed it in a cardboard box. Downstairs, the family life I had paid for continued without me. The sounds of dinner being made, the television blaring, the rhythmic thud of a basketball from the driveway where my grandson Leo was practicing. No one came to help. No one checked on me. It was as if the door to my room, once closed, had rendered me completely invisible. It took me 3 trips to move my life into the basement. The space was exactly as I'd imagined. A corner sectioned off by a dusty sheet hung from a ceiling pipe. The new cot was there, a thin mattress on a metal frame. Next to it was a single cardboard box, which I assumed held the things they had cleared for me. The air was cold and still. A single bare bulb cast long, distorted shadows on the concrete walls. There were no windows, no sun, no jacaranda tree. I sat on the edge of the cot, the thin mattress groaning under my weight. The smell of mildew was sharp in my nostrils. I could hear the muffled footsteps of my family above me, living their lives on a different plane of existence. I was no longer a part of the household. I was the foundation, unseen, unacknowledged, but holding everything up. I pulled the cashmere shawl from a box and wrapped it around my shoulders. But the cold wasn't on my skin. It was inside me, a frozen, solid thing in the center of my chest. That night, I didn't sleep. I just lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the water heater and the creak of the house settling, a stranger buried alive in the heart of her own family. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous gray smear of concrete walls and artificial light. I developed a new routine. I would wake up, get dressed in the cold, and wait until I heard the front door close as Ethan and Sarah left for work and the kids for school. Only then would I creep upstairs to the kitchen to make myself a piece of toast and a cup of tea, a thief in my own son's house. I would wash my plate, my cup, my spoon, and dry them immediately, leaving no trace of my existence. Then, I would retreat back to my subterranean world. Sometimes, Chloe would be home, her voice echoing from my old room, now the studio. I would hear her directing herself, a stream of forced enthusiasm. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's haul is, literally insane. I never saw the finished videos, but I saw the boxes from Dior and Sephora that arrived almost daily. My room, my sunlit sanctuary, was now a shrine to consumerism, a throne for an influencer queen. A few weeks after my relocation, the date on my phone's dim screen glowed back at me. It was my 68th birthday. A small, foolish part of me had held on to a sliver of hope. A cake, perhaps. A card. A simple, "Happy birthday, Mom." The house was quiet all morning. Too quiet. I knew they were home. I could hear the faint murmur of the television in the living room. I stayed in my corner, waiting. Noon came and went. The afternoon light, which I could only gauge by the sliver of brightness under the basement door, began to fade. The silence from upstairs was absolute. They had gone out. I finally ventured up the stairs around 6 o'clock, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. The house was empty. A note was stuck to the gleaming stainless steel refrigerator with a cheerful apple-shaped magnet. "Gone to dinner. Leftovers in the fridge for you. S." My name wasn't even on it. Just you. I opened the refrigerator. Next to a carton of milk and a bottle of Sarah's kombucha was a single plastic container. Inside was a congealed lump of what looked like leftover pasta, a few pieces of chicken lost in a sea of coagulated sauce. My birthday dinner. I closed the door without taking it out. The hollow ache inside me was too vast for food. I retreated to my cot, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I picked up my old cracked phone, my only connection to the outside world. I scrolled aimlessly through my sparse feed, a collection of posts from old friends in Carmel, their lives filled with art shows, beach walks, and grandchildren who seemed to genuinely love them. And then, at exactly 7 p.m., a new post lit up the screen. It was from Chloe's Instagram. A picture, bright and vibrant, that seemed to mock the darkness of my corner. There they were, Ethan, Sarah, Chloe, and Leo. They were on a yacht, the setting sun painting the Newport Harbor sky in shades of orange and pink behind them. They were all dressed in white, smiling dazzlingly, their teeth impossibly bright. They were clinking champagne glasses, their heads thrown back in laughter. A perfect family, a happy family. My breath caught in my throat. I zoomed in, my thumb trembling on the screen. Ethan's arm was around Sarah. Chloe was making a peace sign. Even Leo, who sometimes offered me a flicker of sympathy in his eyes, was smiling. A genuine, carefree smile. They looked beautiful. They looked complete. And then I saw the caption, typed out below the radiant image, accompanied by a single red heart emoji. Family is everything. I stared at the words until they blurred. Family is everything. I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't on the yacht. I wasn't in the sun. I was in a basement, looking at a picture of my family celebrating my birthday without me. I wasn't just forgotten. I had been deliberately, meticulously erased. The phone slipped from my numb fingers and fell onto the thin blanket, the screen staying lit, a cruel, glowing testament to my own invisibility. I wasn't an afterthought. To be an afterthought, you have to have been a thought in the first place. I was nothing. The foundation, buried deep in the cold, dark earth, so they could stand in the sun. Before the damp chill of this basement became the air I breathed, there was another air, thick with salt and the sharp, clean scent of eucalyptus. My name is Ava, and I was not always this invisible. I once lived in a small house perched on the edge of the world in Carmel by the sea. It was a house painted the color of a summer sky just after sunset, with a garden full of unruly lavender and defiant roses that bloomed well into the autumn. My husband Richard and I built that life from the ground up. He was a man of science, of facts and figures, a geneticist who saw the world as an intricate, elegant puzzle. I was an artist. I saw the world in hues and shades, in the way light fell across the water, in the joyful mess of a child discovering for the first time that red and yellow make orange. I was an art teacher. For 30 years, I taught the children of Carmel how to see. Not just how to look, but how to truly see. My classroom smelled of clay, turpentine, and possibility. Richard used to joke that my hands were permanently stained with every color of the rainbow. He would take my hands in his own, his so clean and precise, and trace the smudges of cobalt blue on my knuckles, the fleck of cadmium yellow on my wrist, and he would smile. He said I carried my art on my skin. He was the anchor, the quiet, steady rhythm of my life. I was the sail, catching the wind. We were a perfect balance. Our evenings were filled with a comfortable silence, him with his journals and research papers, me with my sketchbook, the only sounds the scratching of his pen and the soft glide of my charcoal, all set to the constant, soothing soundtrack of the Pacific Ocean just a few blocks away. Our son, Ethan, grew up in that house. He grew up with sand in his shoes and the freedom to be anything he wanted. We gave him everything, not in material wealth, but in love, in support. When he left for college and then built his own life, the house felt a little bigger, a little quieter, but it was still full. It was full of Richard and me and 35 years of shared memories. And then, one Tuesday, Richard was gone. A heart attack, swift and merciless. The silence he left behind wasn't peaceful. It was a roaring, deafening void. The colors of my world seemed to leach away, leaving behind a grayscale landscape of grief. The house, once my sanctuary, became a museum of a life that was no longer mine. Every chair held his ghost. Every book on the shelf was a reminder of a conversation we'd never finish. The ocean's roar no longer sounded like a lullaby. It sounded like a lament. I stopped painting. The canvas was too white, too empty. It mocked me. A few months into this suffocating quiet, Ethan arrived. He came with his wife, Sarah, and their children, Chloe and Leo. He walked through the house, his face a mask of concern. He looked at the dust gathering on my easels, at the untouched canvases leaning against the wall. He saw the loneliness that clung to me like a shroud. He sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a boy, where Richard and I had made a million decisions. He took my hands, just as his father used to, but his touch was different. It wasn't a touch of partnership. It was a touch of purpose. "Mom," he began, his voice soft, reasonable. This place, it's too much for you now. The upkeep, the memories, it's not healthy for you to be here alone." I just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He was right. I was drowning here. "Sarah and I have been talking," he continued, leaning in. "We're thinking of buying a bigger place, a place with a yard for the kids, enough room for everyone. A real family home." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If you sell this house, you could use the money for the down payment. We could all live together. Think about it, Mom. You'd have your grandkids around you every day. You'd have us. You'll never have to be alone again. You'll never be alone again. That was the line. That was the key that turned the lock on my grief-addled heart. The promise of noise, of life, of family to fill the terrible silence. The thought of hearing children's laughter in the hallways again, of having a reason to set the table for more than one. It was a lifeline. I saw a future where the color might return. I didn't see the calculation in his eyes. I didn't register the way Sarah was already mentally redecorating my life. I only saw an escape from the gray. I only heard the promise. So I agreed. I packed up 35 years of a life, sorting memories into boxes labeled keep and donate. I said goodbye to the scent of salt and eucalyptus. I held one last garage sale where strangers bought the small pieces of my history for a few dollars. And then, at the bank, with a sterile blue pen, I signed the papers. I watched the life Richard and I had built transform into a number on a cashier's check. $800,000. I handed it to my son. I wasn't just giving him money. I was giving him my home, my past, and my complete, unvarnished trust. I believed I was buying my way back into a family. I didn't understand then that I was only paying the price of admission. The first few weeks in the new house were a blur of manufactured cheerfulness. It was a large modern house in a manicured suburb far from the sea, a place where all the houses looked the same and the silence was just a different kind of empty. But there was life. Chloe, a teenager permanently attached to her phone, and Leo, a quiet, observant boy, filled the space with the energy of youth. Sarah was the queen of this new castle, directing movers, choosing paint colors, and establishing the rules of her domain. I tried to find my place. I'd unpack a box of my old books, only to be told they didn't match the minimalist aesthetic. My favorite armchair, the one Richard and I had spent so many evenings in, was relegated to the garage because it was a bit dated. I was a guest, trying not to be an inconvenience. I thought, this is just an adjustment period. This is the price of joining their life. I tried to be useful. I did laundry. I cooked meals. I helped Leo with his homework. I was trying to earn my keep, to prove that my presence was a benefit, not a burden. The subtractions began subtly. A friend from Carmel would call, her voice a welcome echo from my old life. We'd be laughing, catching up, and Sarah would appear in the doorway. Ava, could you watch the kids? I have a yoga class. Or Ethan would say, Mom, can you get off the phone? I need to talk to you about the utilities. The calls became shorter, less frequent. The threads connecting me to my past were being snipped, one by one. I was being isolated, corralled into my new, smaller world. Then came the conversation about my pension. It was a modest sum, the result of my 30 years of teaching, but it was mine. It was my independence, my ability to buy my own art supplies, to treat a friend to lunch, to feel like an adult. Ethan sat me down again, this time in his sleek new home office. He had spreadsheets open on his computer. Mom, he said, in that same reasonable tone he'd used in my old kitchen. I've been looking at the finances. It's just so complicated with everything coming from different accounts. The mortgage, the bills, the groceries. It's a lot to track. He swiveled in his chair to face me fully. It would be so much easier, so much more efficient, if we just pooled our resources. If you deposit your pension into our joint account, I can manage everything from one place. You won't have to worry about a single bill. It's about simplifying things, for you. A tiny alarm bell, faint and distant, rang in the back of my mind. The idea of not having my own money, even a small amount, felt wrong. It felt like giving up the last piece of the woman I used to be. I hesitated. I don't know, Ethan. I've always managed my own. He cut me off, his smile patient but firm. Mom, we're family. This is what families do. We support each other. Don't you trust me to take care of you? Don't you trust me? There it was again. The emotional blackmail wrapped in a ribbon of care. To say no would be to accuse him, to create conflict in this fragile new arrangement. I was the one who had been saved from loneliness. I was the one living in the house he had bought, with my money. I felt a wave of guilt. How could I not trust my own son? He was just trying to help. So, once again, I agreed. I signed the forms. I rerouted my pension. I handed over the last key to my independence. And with that signature, my role was cemented. I was no longer Ava, the art teacher from Carmel. I was no longer Richard's wife. I was a dependent, a resident. My life had become a series of subtractions. First my home, then my money, then my friends, and I was beginning to feel the slow, creeping erosion of the final thing I had left. My dignity. I had paid the price of admission, and I was discovering, with a cold, sinking horror, that it had bought me a ticket to a cage. The walk down the basement stairs became a descent into a different state of being. Each wooden step groaned under my weight, a protest that echoed the one screaming silently in my own heart. The door at the top clicked shut behind me, a sound as final as a lock turning in a cell. Down here the air changed. It was thick, heavy with the scent of damp concrete, forgotten cedar chests, and the faint metallic tang of the furnace. A single, naked bulb hung from a wire, casting a weak yellow circle of light that did little to push back the oppressive shadows clinging to the corners. This was my kingdom now. My bed was a thin, lumpy mattress on a creaking metal frame, pushed against a wall that wept beads of condensation in the morning. My nightstand was a cardboard box that once held a blender. My closet was a dusty garment rack where Ethan's old ski jackets hung like ghosts. Upstairs was a world I no longer truly belonged to. I was a function, a utility. My day began, not with the sun, which couldn't find me here, but with the distant rumble of the washing machine starting its first cycle. That was my cue. I'd pull on my worn cardigan, the wool a poor defense against the basement's permanent chill, and climb the stairs back into their world. The laundry room was my first station. Sorting their colors and whites, feeling the fabric of Sarah's expensive yoga pants and Ethan's soft-collared shirts, was an intimate yet alienating task. I was touching the textures of their lives that were running parallel to mine, but never intersecting. The scent of their perfume and cologne, faint on the clothes, was a reminder of their evenings out, their work meetings, their social engagements, a world from which I was completely excluded. After the laundry came the kitchen. It was my second station, and the site of my most profound daily humiliations. I never sat with them to eat anymore. In the beginning, I tried. I'd linger by the table, but there was never a place set for me. Ethan would be absorbed in his tablet, scrolling through market reports. Sarah would be texting, her thumb a blur across the screen. The children, Chloe and Leo, would be bickering or plugged into their own devices, headphones creating invisible walls around them. The first few times I'd stood there, holding a plate, until Sarah would look up with feigned surprise. "Oh, Ava, just grab something from the counter. We saved you a plate." Saving a plate was a euphemism. It was a collection of their rejects, the slightly burnt piece of chicken, the last spoonful of mashed potatoes scraped from the bottom of the pot, the wilted leaves of a salad no one else wanted. It was always cold by the time I got to it. And then there was the cutlery. That was Sarah's masterstroke of subtle cruelty. One evening, I reached for a fork from the silverware drawer, the familiar weight of polished steel in my hand. Sarah's voice, sharp and quick, cut through the air. "Oh no, Ava, not those." She went to a separate, lower drawer, one I'd never opened. She pulled out a plastic bag filled with flimsy white plastic forks, spoons, and knives. "Here," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were doing me a favor. "Use these. They're just for you. So much easier, you know. No need to wash them." The unspoken message was deafening. You are not clean. You are not family. You are a contamination risk. The first time I tried to cut a piece of tough pot roast with one of those forks, a tine snapped off with a pathetic little crack. Ethan didn't look up from his tablet. Chloe snickered. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. From then on, I took my plate of leftovers and my designated plasticware and ate on the top step of the basement stairs. I'd sit there in the dim light, the flimsy fork bending in my hand, listening to the sounds of their lives drifting from the dining room, the clink of real silverware against ceramic plates, the murmur of conversation I wasn't part of, the sudden bursts of laughter that felt like stones being thrown at me in the dark. I was a ghost in my own home, fed on scraps, relegated to the threshold between their world and my subterranean exile. The disdain of the parents was a lesson the children learned with terrifying proficiency. It wasn't overt. It was a slow-drip poison, an education in contempt delivered through sighs, eye rolls, and dismissive gestures. Leo, who was 12 and worshipped his father, adopted Ethan's intellectual condescension. He would corner me when I was trying to rest my aching back in the one armchair they allowed me to use in the living room. He'd shove his glowing tablet in my face, the screen a chaotic explosion of colorful violence. "Grandma, look," he'd say, his voice laced with impatient superiority. "This is my new RPG. The boss has a deterministic attack pattern, but the loot drops are RNG-based. You understand, right? It's about grinding for epic gear." He didn't want me to understand. He wanted me to be confused. My silence, my fumbling for a response, was the punchline he was waiting for. "It's very colorful, dear," I'd manage. He would sigh dramatically, a perfect imitation of his mother, and smirk at Ethan. "She doesn't get it," he'd announce to the room. Ethan would glance over, a flicker of something. Was it pity? Annoyance? In his eyes before he'd just shrug and return to his phone. "She's from a different time, son." His words weren't a defense of me. They were a dismissal, categorizing me as an obsolete relic, a piece of outdated technology that could no longer interface with the modern world. But Chloe was worse. Her cruelty was creative, modern, and public. At 15, she lived her life through the lens of her phone, and she had discovered that I was a source of what she called content. I started noticing it in small ways, the way she'd hold her phone at a low angle when I was near, a sly, knowing smile playing on her lips. I'd be struggling to read the tiny text on a prescription bottle, holding it at arm's length and squinting, and I'd catch a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. It was Chloe, filming. I'd be dozing in the armchair, my head lolling to one side in a moment of pure, bone-deep exhaustion after cleaning the entire house, and the telltale red light of a recording would be pointed at my face. I didn't understand the purpose of it until Leo, in a fit of casual malice, revealed everything. He found me in the kitchen one afternoon, wiping down the counters. "Hey, Grandma," he said, barely hiding his grin. "You're famous." He showed me Chloe's phone. On the screen was a video of me. It was from the week before, when I'd tried to use their new smart TV. I just wanted to watch the local news, but the remote was a sleek black rectangle with no buttons I recognized. The video showed me jabbing at it helplessly, my face a mask of confusion as the screen flashed between Netflix and Hulu, and something called Twitch. Chloe had edited it with goofy sound effects, a slide whistle, a cartoon boing, a synthesized voice saying, "Error, error." The title of the video was Grandma versus the Remote. And then I saw the series title, Grandma Glitches. My breath caught in my throat. Leo scrolled, and there were dozens of them. A video of me trying to figure out how to answer a video call from my old friend, my face uncomfortably close to the camera. A clip of me spilling a little coffee on my saucer, my hand trembling slightly. A super slow-motion video of me snoring lightly in the armchair, my mouth slightly agape. Each one was a tiny, private moment of vulnerability, of aging, of simply being human, twisted into a spectacle for public amusement. The worst part was the comments. Below each video was a torrent of them, a digital mob of strangers laughing at me, thousands of laughing face emojis. LOL, my grandma is the same way. The final boss of taking a nap. This is gold! She's glitching out. I felt a cold, hollowing sensation in my stomach. I wasn't a person to them. I was a meme, a character, a glitch in their perfect, curated world. Chloe wasn't just my granddaughter. She was my documentarian, my judge, and my jury, and she had found me guilty of the crime of being old. I looked up from the phone, my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall. Leo was watching me, his expression expectant, waiting for a reaction. I just turned back to the counter and continued wiping, my hand moving in slow, steady circles, as if I could wipe away the humiliation, the profound sense of violation. but it was no use. The knowledge was there now, a permanent stain on my consciousness. Every time I fumbled, every time I forgot a word, every time my body betrayed me with a moment of weakness, I would wonder, is she filming this? Of all the small daily tortures, Sarah's ritual was the most elegantly cruel. It was a performance of domestic purification, and I was the impurity she needed to cleanse. It happened every single time I came up from the basement and entered the main living area, particularly the pristine living room with its white carpet and beige sofas. She had a can of lavender-scented air freshener that she kept on the mantelpiece like a trophy. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, her head would lift. She would put down her magazine or pause her show. A tight, artificial smile would stretch across her lips. "Oh, Ava," she'd say, her voice light and airy. "You're up." Then she would rise, walk to the mantelpiece, and retrieve the can. The hiss of the aerosol can was the opening shot. She wouldn't just spray the air around the room. She would walk towards me. She would circle me, as if I were a piece of contaminated furniture, spraying a fine mist of cloying, chemical lavender into the air around my body. She sprayed the space I had just occupied, the path I was about to walk. She was drawing an invisible boundary, a chemical barrier between me and her perfect, clean world. "Just freshening things up a bit," she'd say every time, that same tight smile never wavering. The words were a lie, and we both knew it. She wasn't freshening the room. She was erasing me from it. She was waging war against my very presence, against the scent she had decided was the smell of old age. Ethan would watch this. He would be sitting on the sofa, feet up on the ottoman, and he would see his wife perform this daily act of humiliation. He never said a word. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. He'd just shift his gaze back to his laptop or clear his throat, a silent endorsement of her actions. His silence was his consent. His inaction was his complicity. He was a partner in my erasure. The lavender scent would cling to my clothes and my hair, an unwanted perfume of my own degradation. When I would finally retreat back down to my basement room, the chemical floral scent would follow me, mingling with the honest smell of damp earth and old paper. It was a constant reminder that upstairs, I was considered a contaminant. I would sit on my lumpy mattress in the dark, the smell of lavender filling my nostrils, and I would feel myself shrinking, becoming smaller and smaller, until I felt as invisible as they so clearly wished I was. Each day was another small cut, another subtle shove towards the edge, and I absorbed it all in silence, a silence that was slowly filling with a pressure I didn't know how much longer I could contain. It happened on a Tuesday, a day of the week that had always felt like a bland, gray space between the memory of the weekend and the promise of the next. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, a woman who seemed to be sculpted from disciplined kale smoothies and the rhythmic hum of her Peloton bike, collapsed at the dinner table. One moment, she was lifting a fork full of quinoa salad, her face illuminated by the cold light of her phone propped against a water glass. The next, the fork clattered to the floor, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to slice through the mundane drone of the television. Her body followed, not with a dramatic cry, but with a soft, boneless slump, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. For a moment, nobody moved. Ethan, my son, stared, his own fork halfway to his mouth. Chloe and Leo, my grandchildren, looked up from their screens, their eyes wide with a confusion that hadn't yet curdled into fear. I was standing in the doorway from the kitchen, a dish rag in my hand, an invisible fixture in my own home. My presence was so thoroughly ignored that my gasp was swallowed by the sudden silence. It was Ethan who broke the spell. He lunged forward, shouting Sarah's name, his voice cracking with a panic I hadn't heard since he was a small boy afraid of the dark. The diagnosis at the hospital was a swift, brutalist hammer blow to the fragile architecture of their perfect life. Acute renal failure. Her kidneys, those diligent, silent workers, had simply stopped. They were gone. She needed a transplant. Immediately. The days that followed were a blur of sterile white corridors, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, and the low antiseptic scent of cleaning fluids. I became a ghost in the waiting room, occupying a corner chair, my presence as unremarkable as the wilting ficus in the corner. A frantic search for a donor began, a desperate lottery of blood types and tissue compatibility. Ethan was tested first, his face a mask of anxious self-importance. He was not a match. The news landed on him like a personal affront, as if his own body had betrayed his role as the family's hero. Chloe and Leo were too young, ineligible. The doctors, their faces etched with professional sympathy, started using words like dialysis and waiting list, words that hung in the air like a death sentence. It was a younger doctor, a resident with tired eyes, who finally turned his gaze to me. It wasn't a look of consideration, but one of last resort calculation. "What about you, Mrs. Evans? Have we tested you?" The question was directed more towards Ethan than to me. Ethan just shrugged, a gesture of dismissive hopelessness. "She's old," he'd muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Her health is, you know." But they were running out of options, so I was tested. I submitted to the needle, the soft pressure of the tourniquet, the cool swab of alcohol on the thin skin of my inner arm. I expected nothing. I was the family's afterthought, the resident of the basement, the woman whose existence was a minor inconvenience. The results came back a few days later. The lead nephrologist called us into a small, windowless office. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time. There was a strange awe in his eyes. "It's remarkable, Mrs. Evans," he said, shuffling papers on his desk. "Your compatibility is frankly astounding." He looked at Ethan, then back at me. "You are a perfect match, a 1-in-a-million genetic match." The words didn't feel real. They were a statistical anomaly, a biological glitch. In that sterile room, under the hum of the fluorescent lights, I, Ava, the superfluous old woman whose teacups were kept separate, whose presence was scrubbed away by air freshener, was suddenly the most valuable person in their world. The key, the cure, the perfect match. And in Ethan's eyes, I saw not a flicker of love or gratitude. I saw the dawning light of a new kind of ownership. The first call came not from my son, but from his lawyer. I was down in my basement room, folding their laundry, the scent of their fabric softener clinging to my clothes, when my cheap, prepaid phone buzzed on the concrete floor. The name on the screen was unfamiliar. A man's voice, smooth and polished as Riverstone, introduced himself as Mr. Davies, the family's legal counsel. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spoke of familial obligation, a phrase that sounded obscene coming from a stranger. He talked about moral duty, as if it were a clause in a contract I had unknowingly signed. He never raised his voice. He never explicitly said, "You must do this." He didn't have to. "Ava," he said, using my first name with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. "We all want what's best for Sarah, for the family. Ethan is under tremendous strain. We just want to ensure that all existing arrangements continue smoothly." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "It would be a tragedy if your current living situation, your financial arrangement with your son, were to become untenable." Untenable. The word was a velvet-gloved fist. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of concern. He was talking about my home, the 4 walls Ethan had convinced me to fund. He was talking about my pension, the money that disappeared into a joint account the moment it arrived. He was reminding me that I had nothing. That they had taken everything, and the one thing I had left, a part of my own body, was now being called in as the final payment on a debt I never agreed to owe. I said nothing. My throat was tight, a knot of old grief and new fear. The line of my mouth was a thin, hard line. I could feel the damp chill of the basement seeping into my bones. After I hung up, the silence in the room was heavier than before, filled with the weight of his unspoken words. I was no longer just their live-in help. I was a biological asset, and they had just sent their lawyer to appraise my value and warn me of the consequences of withholding it. The second attack was far more public and infinitely crueler. It came from Chloe. A few nights after the lawyer's call, my phone began to buzz incessantly. It wasn't a call, but a torrent of notifications, a digital flood I didn't understand. It was Leo, my younger grandson, who showed me. He came down the basement stairs, his face pale, holding his own phone out to me like it was a venomous snake. "Grandma," he whispered, "you need to see this." On the screen was Chloe's face, filmed in stark, dramatic black and white. She was standing outside the hospital, her hair artfully disheveled, tears tracing clean paths down her cheeks. The video was slick, professionally sad. "I don't know what to do," she began, her voice a carefully calibrated sob. "We found a donor for my mom, a perfect match, the answer to all our prayers." She paused, taking a shaky breath and looking directly into the camera, a master of manufactured vulnerability. "It's my grandma, my dad's mom." Another tear escaped, catching the light. "She's a perfect match to save my mom's life, and she's thinking about it." She let those words hang in the air, a devastating accusation. "She's thinking about it. I know it's a big thing to ask, but this is my mom. Please, everyone, please, just pray she does the right thing. Pray for my family." The video ended with a close-up on her tear-filled eyes, and text appeared on the screen. #SaveSarah. The hashtag had gone viral. It was everywhere. My social media, which I rarely used, was a battlefield. I scrolled through comments, my hands trembling. What kind of monster wouldn't save her own family? One read, "That poor girl. Her grandma is pure evil. I hope she rots in that basement they talk about." They knew about the basement. Chloe had woven our entire family narrative into her performance. I was the wicked grandmother, the ungrateful elder, hoarding my health while my beautiful, kind daughter-in-law wasted away. I was branded a monster by millions of strangers who had swallowed Chloe's poison-laced story whole. The digital world, a place I barely understood, had become a jury, and I had already been convicted. The weight of their hatred felt more real, more crushing than the concrete ceiling above my head. Hiding from the storm of unseen judgment, I retreated deeper into the subterranean world they had assigned me. I couldn't bear to look at my phone. I couldn't face the accusing silence from upstairs. I needed a distraction, a mindless task to quiet the screaming in my own head. I started sorting through the boxes that had been piled in the corner when I was moved down here. Boxes filled with the sediment of a life I barely recognized as my own. Most of it was junk, old photo albums Ethan and Sarah hadn't wanted to display, clothes I no longer wore, the detritus of a past they were actively trying to erase. Tucked behind a stack of musty yearbooks, I found it. A heavy, dark green metal case. It was my husband's, Richard's. It was locked with a small, tarnished brass latch. I hadn't seen it in years. I ran my fingers over the cold metal, a jolt of memory, sharp and painful, running through me. I found the key on an old keyring in a forgotten jewelry box, its teeth still sharp. With a stiff click, the lock gave way. I lifted the lid, expecting to find old love letters, perhaps photographs from our life in Carmel, a tangible piece of the man I had loved. But there were no photos. The box was packed tight with manila folders, filled not with memories, but with old medical files, dense research notes, and scientific journals. I frowned, confused. I never knew he'd kept any of this. Richard, my gentle, art-loving husband, had been a geneticist before we met. He rarely spoke of it. He'd left the field abruptly, under what he vaguely described as a cloud of academic controversy I never pressed him to explain. He had seemed happier as a history professor, happier with me. Seeing these files felt like uncovering a secret room in a house I thought I knew perfectly. The notes were dense, filled with diagrams of DNA helices and terminology that was foreign to me. But one file, thinner than the rest, had a simple label on the tab, written in Richard's familiar, elegant script. It was my name, Ava. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Why would he have a medical file on me? My hands, suddenly clumsy, opened the folder. Inside was not a medical chart, but a letter, a multi-page confession written on his personal letterhead, dated just a few years before he died. "My dearest Ava," it began, "if you are reading this, It means I am gone, and I have left you with a truth I was too cowardly to speak in life." The words on the page began to swim. The story he laid out was a demolition of my past. He wrote of our struggles to conceive, the miscarriages that had left me broken, a hollowed-out version of myself. He wrote of his desperation, his fear of losing me to my grief, and then he confessed. In a moment of weakness and despair, he had a brief affair, a single catastrophic mistake. The woman, a graduate student in his department, became pregnant. She had no family, no one to turn to. She died in childbirth, and Richard, terrified and ashamed, did the only thing he could think of. He brought the baby home. He told me the child was a private adoption, a miracle that had fallen into our laps. The adoption papers he showed me were real. He'd had them legally drawn up. But the story he'd told me, the foundation upon which I had built my identity as a mother, was a lie. Ethan was not our adopted son. He was my husband's illegitimate child. I had spent 40 years raising the evidence of Richard's greatest betrayal, loving a boy who was a living, breathing secret. The reason Ethan wasn't a match for Sarah suddenly became starkly, cruelly clear. He shared no blood with me at all. But that didn't explain the other half of the puzzle. It didn't explain why I was a perfect match. My mind was reeling, a storm of conflicting emotions, grief for the husband I thought I knew, a strange new pity for the baby he'd been, and a cold, sharp anger that was just beginning to crystallize. The why still echoed in the silence of the basement. Driven by a desperate need to understand, I turned back to the metal box. The answer had to be in there. I began to sift through the other files, the ones filled with Richard's academic research. My eyes scanned pages of dense scientific text, but now I had a new lens through which to see it. I wasn't just looking at old work. I was looking for a connection. I found it in a thick folder labeled Familial HRNC. The notes were complex, but the summary was clear enough for a layperson to grasp. Richard had been studying a rare recessive gene cluster that caused a host of autoimmune disorders, including, I saw with a jolt, early-onset renal nephropathy. It was a genetic flaw specific to his own family's bloodline. He had been mapping its path through generations, a quiet academic obsession he'd never once mentioned. He was studying a sickness that ran in his own blood. And then, tucked into the very back of that file, I found the final piece. It wasn't a research paper. It was a single sheet of yellowed, brittle paper, a handwritten letter to Richard. The penmanship was looping and feminine. I didn't recognize it. "Dearest Ricky," it began. It was a confession, full of shame and regret. It was from a woman I'd never met, a woman who signed her name at the bottom. It was from Sarah's mother. In the letter, she confessed a secret she had carried her whole life. She was not who she claimed to be. She was Richard's half-sister, born from a brief affair his own father had decades ago, a hidden branch on a family tree rotten with secrets. She had only discovered the truth after her mother's death and had written to Richard, her only known relative, in a desperate attempt to connect. I had no idea if he ever replied. The world tilted on its axis. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. Sarah, my cruel, dismissive daughter-in-law, was not just my son's wife. She was my husband's niece. The sickness that was destroying her kidneys wasn't random. It was this. It was the genetic flaw from Richard's family, the sickness in their bloodline. And the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The same rare, 1-in-a-million genetic fluke that had once made me a perfect potential donor for Richard, had he ever needed one, was the same reason I was a perfect match for his niece. My body wasn't a miracle. It was a key, a living biological key that unlocked a generation of secrets and infidelity and lies. And they wanted to cut it out of me to save the legacy of a family that had been lying to me from the very beginning. A cold, clarifying calm washed over me. The fear was gone, replaced by something hard and clear and dangerous. The game had changed, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly what I had to do. The family's sudden shift in attitude was a performance so grotesquely transparent, it was almost masterful. The cruelty had been honest, at least. This new, cloying solicitude was a poison wrapped in honey. After the bombshell of my perfect compatibility, the atmosphere in the house changed overnight. The air, once thick with their contempt, was now heavy with a cloying, suffocating kindness. It was the kindness of a butcher sharpening his knife while stroking the lamb. Ethan approached me that evening, his face a carefully constructed mask of filial concern. He found me in my basement dwelling, sitting on the edge of the lumpy cot they called my bed. He didn't recoil at the damp chill as he usually did. Instead, he crouched down, trying to meet my eye level, a pantomime of respect that made my stomach turn. "Mom," he began, his voice oozing a synthetic warmth. "We've been talking. Me, Sarah, Chloe. We know this is a lot to ask. A huge decision." I looked at him, letting my eyes appear clouded, my expression vacant. I focused on a water stain on the concrete wall behind him, a creeping map of neglect. I had to become the woman they saw me as. Slow, confused, easily led. A relic whose only remaining function was to be dismantled for parts. "It's a lot to think about, Ethan," I murmured, my voice a dry whisper. I made sure to let it tremble just so. He seized on my hesitation, his eyes glinting with a predatory relief. He thought this was the predictable wavering of a weak-willed old woman. "Of course, it is. And we don't want to pressure you." Sarah would never want that. He paused, letting the lie hang in the musty air. "We just want you to know. We'll support you through it all. The surgery, the recovery. You'll have the best care. You'll have us." The hypocrisy was a physical force, pressing down on me. The people who had relegated me to a cellar, who fed me leftovers on plastic plates, were now promising me the world for a piece of my body, the piece they needed to save the woman who sprayed air freshener to erase my presence. I looked at my hands, folded in my lap. They were old hands, veined and spotted, but they were strong. They had held my husband, cradled Ethan, graded thousands of student art projects, tilled gardens, and painted canvases that captured the very soul of the sea. Now they wanted to strap these hands down, put me to sleep, and harvest me like a crop. "I need time," I said, looking up at him with what I hoped was a pleading, bewildered expression. To pray on it. I need to consider the spiritual implications." It was the perfect line. It was something a feeble, God-fearing old woman would say. It was a language Ethan understood. A delay, not a refusal. A hurdle to be managed, not a wall to be scaled. He patted my knee, his touch lingering a moment too long. A gesture of ownership. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need. We understand." His eyes said something else entirely. They said, "Hurry up. Sarah is waiting." Over the next few days, the performance intensified. Chloe, my tormentor-in-chief, the architect of Grandma Glitches, suddenly became my shadow. She'd appear with a cup of tea, her smile stapled to her face. "Here, Grandma. I made this just how you like it." The tea was always lukewarm, but I'd sip it with a grateful, shaky hand, thanking her profusely. One afternoon, she found me struggling to read the small print on a medicine bottle, a genuine moment of frustration she would normally have filmed with glee. Instead, she knelt beside me, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "Let me help you with that, Grandma. Your eyes must be tired." She read the label for me, her proximity suffocating. I could smell her expensive perfume, a floral scent designed to mask the stench of her deceit. As she read, her phone lay face up on the floor beside her. A notification lit up the screen, a comment on her latest video, a tear-streaked, emotionally manipulative plea for prayers for her mother, with a carefully worded insinuation that her selfish grandmother was holding her mother's life in her hands. She had posted it, an hour after Ethan had promised me all the time I needed. I saw the view count, 2.1 million. I feigned weariness, letting my head loll back against the damp wall. "Thank you, dear. You're such a good girl." She beamed, a wolf in sheep's clothing, convinced of her own cleverness. "Anything for you, Grandma." They saw my silence as weakness, a slow, inevitable caving in. They interpreted my vacant stares and slow responses as the confusion of old age, a prelude to surrender. They didn't see the ice forming in my veins, the silent, cold fury that was crystallizing into a diamond-hard resolve. They were so busy acting kind that they failed to notice I was acting too. And I was a far, far better actor than they were. The key to my escape, the first brick in my arc, was a silver locket Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. It was heavy, ornate, and deeply unfashionable, which is why I'd been allowed to keep it. Sarah had probably deemed it worthless. Inside, behind the tiny, faded photos of him and a younger me, was a small, hollow space. And in that space, folded into a minuscule square, were 2 crisp $100 bills. Richard, ever the planner, ever my protector, had called it getaway money. A joke between us, a romantic notion of running off together. Now, it was my war chest. I waited for a Tuesday. Ethan had a business lunch, and Chloe had a collab with another influencer across town. The house fell into a rare, deep silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. This was it, the first move. My hands trembled as I worked the locket's clasp. The 2 bills felt like a sacrament in my palm. I tucked them deep into the pocket of the worn cardigan I always wore, a garment so old and shabby it was practically invisible to them. I put on my most sensible, worn-out walking shoes. To anyone watching, I would look like a slightly dazed old woman, going for a bit of air. Slipping out the back door was easier than I imagined. They had grown so accustomed to my passivity, my confinement, that the idea of me simply leaving was beyond their consideration. The sunlight was blindingly bright after the perpetual twilight of the basement. For a moment, I felt a surge of panic. The world seemed too big, too loud. But then, I thought of Sarah's smug face on the hospital video call, of Chloe's mocking laugh, of Ethan's patronizing hand on my knee. The fear was burned away by the cold fire of purpose. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, my steps measured and even, resisting the urge to look over my shoulder. Every car that passed felt like a potential threat. At the bus stop, I didn't check my phone. I didn't have one they didn't monitor. I just waited, a placid-faced old woman enjoying the day. The bus ride was a blur of unfamiliar streets and faces. I got off downtown, in a part of the city I hadn't seen in years. It was noisy and anonymous, and I drank it in like water. Anonymity was a shield. I found a 7-Eleven, its garish colors a beacon of mundane normalcy. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and sugar. A young man with tired eyes and headphones stood behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, barely looking up. "I'd like to buy one of those, please," I said, pointing to a rack of prepaid cell phones in hard plastic packaging. A burner phone, a term I'd learned from the crime dramas Richard and I used to watch. He slid one off the hook. "This one's $40, plus you gotta buy a minutes card." "Yes, that's fine," I said, my voice steady. I handed him one of Richard's $100 bills. As he made change, I bought a bottle of water and a small notebook and pen. Supplies. Back on the street, I found a small, quiet park. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tear open the plastic packaging. I followed the simple instructions, my brow furrowed in concentration. The phone blinked to life with a cheerful little chime. It was a lifeline. A weapon. I opened the notebook. On my last supervised trip to the library, while Chloe had been scrolling through her phone, bored, I had gone to the public resources computer. I hadn't looked up art or gardening. I had searched for legal aid elder abuse. I'd memorized one name and number, repeating it to myself over and over again like a mantra, burning it into my memory. I dialed the number. My breath caught in my throat. "Community Legal Services. How can I direct your call?" A brisk voice answered. "Hello," I began, my voice cracking. I cleared my throat. I need to speak to someone about elder abuse." The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Saying it out loud made it real in a way my silent suffering never had. There was a pause, and then the voice softened slightly. "One moment. I'll connect you with our intake coordinator." A few minutes later, a new voice was on the line. I told her a clipped, edited version of my story, leaving out the genetic bombshells for now. I spoke of the basement, the financial control, the emotional neglect. I was passed to a paralegal. I told the story again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I was told a lawyer would call me back. I sat on the park bench, the cheap plastic phone clutched in my hand, watching mothers push their children on swings. For the first time in a decade, I was entirely on my own, and I had never felt more powerful. 2 hours later, the phone vibrated, a startling buzz against my palm, an unknown number. Hello? Am I speaking with Ava? The voice was female, sharp and clear, with no room for nonsense. Yes, this is she. Ava, my name is Maria Flores. I'm an attorney with Community Legal Services. I've been briefed on your situation. Do you have a safe time to talk? The word safe struck me. She understood. Yes, I'm outside. Good. I could hear the sound of a keyboard clicking in the background. I've reviewed the intake notes. It's a classic case of financial and emotional coercion. Unfortunately, I see dozens like it a year. Now, you'll need to come to my office. You'll need to bring any documentation you have. Bank statements, deeds, wills, anything. I took a deep breath. I have more than that. Oh? There was a flicker of professional interest in her voice. I have my late husband's personal research files. I met Maria 2 days later. Her office was in a small, unassuming building wedged between a bail bondsman and a taqueria. The room was cluttered with stacks of files and law books, powered by lukewarm coffee and a palpable sense of righteous anger. Maria herself was in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a handshake that was firm and confident. She wore no makeup, and her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She was all business. I had brought Richard's metal box with me in a large, drab tote bag, the kind of thing a grandmother would use for groceries. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the secrets it held. She listened, her expression initially one of professional sympathy as I laid out the last 10 years. The move, the promise, the slow stripping away of my autonomy. The basement, the plastic cutlery. I saw her jaw tighten. Then, I told her about the Grandma Glitches videos. I saw her professional mask slip, revealing a flash of cold fury. They posted videos? She asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Publicly humiliating you? My granddaughter Chloe is an influencer. Maria wrote something down, her pen scratching viciously across the legal pad. Good, she muttered. That's very, very good for us. Then I opened the box. I laid out the contents on her cluttered desk. The old, yellowed lab reports, the detailed genealogical charts, Richard's precise academic handwriting. I walked her through it, piece by piece. I started with the file labeled EH Paternity. Ethan is not my biological son, I said, the words feeling strange and liberating in this sterile office. He was Richard's son, from an affair. His birth mother died in childbirth. Richard came to me, confessed everything, and begged me to raise the boy as our own. I did. Maria's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. She just scanned the authenticated birth certificate and the DNA comparison report Richard had commissioned years ago. Then I pulled out the second folder, the one that held the real cataclysm, the one marked Habsburg genetic marker, familial kidney disease. I explained Richard's work as a geneticist, his quiet obsession with a rare recessive gene cluster in his own family line, a flaw in the bloodline that led to early onset renal failure. He was tracking it, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. He wanted to know if he had passed it on to Ethan. Maria leaned forward, her focus absolute. And did he? No, I said. Ethan is a carrier, but he doesn't have the active markers. He's safe. I paused, then pushed the final documents across the desk. A letter from a woman I'd never met, and a final DNA report, one that compared Richard's genetics to Sarah's. But Sarah does. Maria read the letter, her expression unreadable. It was from Sarah's mother, written to Richard years before he died. A confession. She was Richard's half-sister, the product of an affair his father had kept secret his entire life. Maria looked up from the papers, her eyes boring into mine. The full, monstrous picture was finally clear to her. So Sarah is Richard's niece, she said slowly, connecting the dots. Yes, I confirmed. She inherited the genetic flaw from her mother, Richard's secret sister, the same flaw he spent years studying. The kidney failure wasn't random bad luck. It was her inheritance, and my perfect one-in-a-million match. It has nothing to do with being her mother-in-law. It's because my own biology was a perfect match for my husband Richard, and by extension, for his niece. A long, heavy silence filled the room. Maria leaned back in her chair, staring at the pile of documents on her desk. The skepticism I'd first seen in her eyes was long gone. It had been replaced by a look of profound, icy rage. She looked at me, not with pity, but with a fierce, burgeoning respect. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice low and steady, "they are not just going to lose this case. We are going to burn their entire world to the ground." While Ethan and Chloe were at home, discussing the logistics of my generous gift, their conversations a mix of feigned concern for me and real concern for their social calendar, I was quietly preparing for war. Maria called it building the ark. We were gathering the materials piece by piece to survive the flood we were about to unleash. The first step was money. While I feigned confusion about my own bank accounts, Maria, armed with the power of attorney Richard had established for her in one of his secret files, went to work. It turned out my late husband, my brilliant, paranoid, loving Richard, had not just left me memories. He had set up a series of offshore accounts under my maiden name, Ava Dubois. He had been quietly siphoning money into them for years, a financial fortress I never knew existed. Maria called me on the burner phone one afternoon. I was in the basement, folding their laundry, the smell of Chloe's expensive detergent filling my small space. "Ava, are you sitting down?" Maria's voice was electric. "I'm always sitting down, Maria," I said dryly. I could hear the smile in her voice. "The accounts in the Cayman Islands." He seeded them with the profits from 2 pharmaceutical patents he sold in the late 90s. "Ava, there's over $2 million. I closed my eyes. The laundry basket in my lap suddenly felt weightless. $2 million. It wasn't a number I could comprehend. It wasn't about the luxury. It was about the sheer, absolute fact of it. It was freedom. It was power. It was a voice. I didn't weep with joy. A cold, hard certainty settled in my bones. He had known, somehow. He had known I would need protecting even after he was gone. "Okay," I said, my voice even. "Just okay?" Maria laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Ava, you're a wealthy woman." "I was always a wealthy woman, Maria," I replied. "They just stole the keys. Now we're getting them back." The next phase of the ark's construction was documentation. I became a spy in my own prison. I used the new burner phone, with its surprisingly decent camera, to become my own crime scene photographer. I waited until the house was empty, my heart pounding a steady, martial rhythm. I photographed everything. The damp, dark stain spreading across the concrete wall, the single, bare light bulb hanging from a frayed wire, the pathetic cot with its thin, stained mattress, the pile of my belongings stuffed into cardboard boxes in the corner. I took a close-up of the cheap plastic fork and spoon Sarah had bought for me, the special set, so I wouldn't contaminate their silver. Each photograph was an indictment, a silent scream. Then came the hardest part. I went online, using the Wi-Fi I siphoned from a neighbor, and navigated to Chloe's TikTok page. My hands shook. This time, with a pure, unadulterated rage, I forced myself to watch them all. Grandma glitches. There I was, squinting at my phone. There I was, nodding off in a chair after a day of cleaning their house. There I was, struggling to open a jar of pickles, her mocking laughter overlaid as a soundtrack. With Maria's emailed instructions, I learned how to download each video, saving the digital files to the phone's memory card. Every click of the download button was a nail in their coffin. I was taking their weapon, the tool of my humiliation, and turning it back on them. I was gathering the shrapnel to build my bomb. The final piece of the ark was my own body. Ethan had scheduled a full medical workup for me at the hospital where Sarah was being treated. "Just a formality, Mom," he'd said breezily, "to make sure you're strong enough for the donation." I agreed, of course, with a feeble nod. But the day before the scheduled appointment, I took a bus to a different clinic, one Maria had found for me. It was a small private practice run by a stern, elderly doctor who looked at me over his spectacles with kind, weary eyes. "Maria Flores sent you," he said, not as a question. "Let's see what they've done to you." It wasn't a workup for a donation. It was a workup for a lawsuit. And he documented everything. My weight, down 15 pounds from a year ago. The signs of mild malnutrition. My elevated blood pressure, a classic symptom of chronic stress. He listened to my heart, to my lungs. He took blood. He treated me not as a collection of spare parts, but as a human being. "The report will be ready in 48 hours, he said as I left, patting my arm. "You take care of yourself, Mrs. Hayes." That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, Ethan slid a bowl of soup in front of me. It was real soup, not the watery leftovers I usually got. It even had chunks of chicken in it. "You need to keep your strength up, Mom," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Chloe sat opposite, scrolling through her phone, probably counting the likes on her latest tearful video. I looked at the soup. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the stranger sitting across from me. I looked at my granddaughter, who had sold my dignity for clicks. They were planning my recovery. They were debating how they would manage my post-operative care, how inconvenient it would be. They had no idea. I was not preparing for a surgery. I was not preparing for recovery. In the damp silence of my basement room, the burner phone was charging. On its memory card was a gallery of my prison, a library of my humiliation, a full medical report of my neglect, and the account numbers for a future they couldn't even imagine. They thought they were building a bridge to Sarah's survival, using me as the foundation. They were wrong. I was building an ark, and I was preparing for a flood of my own making, a flood that would wash them all away. The air in the conference room was the color of old ice and just as cold. It was a space designed to leach the humanity out of you, with its polished mahogany table that reflected our faces like distorted funhouse mirrors, and its floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a gray, indifferent city. It was the perfect stage for the final act of my erasure. Ethan sat directly across from me, his shoulders squared in a suit that looked too tight, a posture of feigned authority. Beside him, his daughter Chloe fidgeted, her thumbs scrolling ceaselessly on the phone in her lap, a nervous tic she'd developed in tandem with her online fame. At the head of the table sat their lawyer, a man named Mr. Davies, whose smile was a thin, predatory slash. He radiated a false sincerity that was more offensive than open hostility. And then there was Sarah. Her face, pale and gaunt, flickered on a large television screen mounted to the wall. She was patched in via video from her hospital bed, a digital ghost at her own tribunal. The pristine white of her pillows and the sterile blue of her gown made her look like a fallen angel, an image I was certain Chloe had carefully curated for maximum pathos. On the table, midway between me and them, lay a sheaf of papers, the consent forms. An official, legally binding contract for a piece of my body. Mr. Davies folded his hands, the picture of magnanimous reason. "Ava," he began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that likely cost Ethan a fortune per hour. "Thank you for coming. We all know this has been a difficult time, a time of great stress and uncertainty." He paused, letting the words hang in the refrigerated air. "But difficult times are when family matters most. It's when we show who we really are. It's a time to set aside petty grievances, to think of the future, to think of legacy." He gestured vaguely toward Chloe, then to the screen where Sarah's pixelated face watched, her eyes wide and expectant. "It's time to be a family." Ethan leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. It was a gesture he'd copied from some movie CEO, meant to project power, but his knuckles were white. "Mom," he said, the words sounding foreign and brittle in this room. "Just sign the papers." "This is for Sarah. This is for all of us. Think of Leo. Think of Chloe. They need their mother. I need my wife." He was trying to sound like a desperate husband, a loving son, but all I could hear was the petulant whine of a boy who was about to have his favorite toy taken away. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, her eyes expertly moistened. I wondered if she'd practiced in the mirror, or if the tears were a special effect she'd learned from a tutorial. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice cracking on cue. "Please, Mom she's fading. Every day, we watch her get weaker. Don't you love her? Don't you love us?" I looked at them. The concerned son, the grieving granddaughter, the benevolent lawyer, the dying wife. It was a perfect tableau of familial devotion, a masterpiece of fiction. For so long, I had been the silent, invisible audience to the grand theater of their lives. I had listened to their plans from my basement room, watched their triumphs on a tiny, cracked phone screen, and felt the aftershocks of their dramas. But today, I was not in the audience. I had written a new final act. My own. I held their gazes one by one. I let the silence stretch, becoming a fifth presence in the room. I watched the confidence drain from Ethan's face, replaced by a flicker of irritation. I saw Chloe's lip begin to tremble for real, a loss of control that clearly frustrated her. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, his smile tightening. Only Sarah, on her screen, remained perfectly still, a portrait of tragic hope. They were waiting for the weak, confused old woman to acquiesce. The grandma glitches from Chloe's cruel videos. They expected me to weep, to bargain, to fold. They had no idea who I was. I had spent weeks becoming a ghost in my own life, a creature of shadow and memory. But in this cold, sterile room, I was about to become a reckoning. I said nothing. My movements were slow, deliberate, amplified by the suffocating quiet. I reached down to the worn leather bag at my feet, the one Richard had given me for our 10th anniversary. My hand closed around a thin manila folder. It felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the truth of 3 generations. I placed it on the polished mahogany. The soft thud was as loud as a gunshot. It slid across the gleaming surface, a slow, inexorable journey, coming to a rest directly in front of Ethan. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "Before I sign anything," I said, and my own voice surprised me. It was not the reedy, hesitant voice of the woman who ate leftovers with a plastic spork. It was clear, steady, and cold. It was the voice of the woman I used to be, the voice of a teacher, a wife, a person of substance. "You should see this." Mr. Davies scoffed lightly. "Mrs. Miller, with all due respect, I don't think any more documents are necessary." "The situation is quite clear." "See it," I repeated, my eyes locked on Ethan. He hesitated, looking to his lawyer for guidance. Davies gave a slight, dismissive shrug, as if indulging a senile whim. With a sigh of theatrical exasperation, Ethan reached out and flipped the folder open. Chloe leaned in, her curiosity overriding her performance. On the screen, Sarah's brow furrowed. The first page was a photocopy of a page from Richard's journals, a complex diagram of a gene cluster surrounded by his tight, academic scrawl. Ethan stared at it, uncomprehending. He flipped to the next page, a lab report, a DNA analysis. He scanned the names, his eyes widening slightly. He saw his father's name, Richard Miller. He saw a name he didn't recognize, Helen Croft, Sarah's mother. And he saw Sarah's name. Lines and percentages he couldn't possibly understand connected them all. Then he turned the page again. This one was a letter, written in a spidery, elegant hand I recognized immediately. It was a copy of the letter Helen had sent to Richard years ago, the one I had found with the journals, the one confessing their shared parentage, that she was his secret half-sister. The color drained from Ethan's face. It was a cliché, something you read in books, but I watched it happen in real time. The blood receded from his skin, leaving a pallid, waxy mask. He looked from the papers to me, his mouth opening and closing silently. Chloe was just confused, looking back and forth between the cryptic documents and her father's horrified expression. "Dad, what is it? What does that mean?" The lawyer Davies snatched the papers from Ethan's nerveless fingers. His professional veneer was gone. He read them quickly, his eyes darting across the pages, his jaw tightening with every line. The predatory smile had vanished, replaced by a grim, calculating stare. He knew. He was smart enough to understand exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at the complete and total demolition of their case, of their narrative, of their entire fabricated world. I turned my gaze from the men at the table to the woman on the screen. I looked directly into the camera, into Sarah's confused, waiting eyes. It was time for the truth serum. "You're wondering why you're sick, Sarah," I said, my voice calm, almost conversational. "You think it's a cruel twist of fate, a random lightning strike of biology that only I can fix." A small, confused shake of her head on the screen. "It's not random at all," I continued. "You need my kidney because you inherited a disease. A rare, recessive genetic flaw that causes catastrophic renal failure. It's been lurking in your bloodline for generations." I let that sink in. I looked at Ethan, who is now staring at his wife on the screen, a look of dawning horror on his face. "It's not your mother's bloodline, Ethan. It's your father's, Richard's." The room was utterly still. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I looked back at Sarah. "Your grandfather, Richard's father, was not a faithful man. He had another family, a secret one. Your mother, Helen, was his illegitimate daughter, Richard's half-sister." A sharp, strangled gasp came from Chloe. She finally understood a piece of it. "My husband, your uncle, knew all about it. He was a geneticist, you see. He spent years studying the flaw, the sickness that ran through his own family. He tracked it. He feared it. It's all there, in his notes." I gestured to the folder in the lawyer's hand. "This isn't about a mother-in-law saving a daughter-in-law," I said, my voice dropping, becoming as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "This is about your own tainted bloodline, Sarah, demanding a price from a stranger you invited into your home only to discard in the basement. You're not just sick. You are the culmination of a legacy of lies and infidelity, and you want me to pay for it with a piece of my body." A single tear finally escaped Sarah's eye and slid down her pale cheek on the screen. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of comprehension, of utter devastation. Ethan made a choked sound, half protest, half sob. "No, that's a lie. You're lying." I slowly, deliberately, pushed my chair back. The scrape of its legs on the floor was unnaturally loud. I stood up. I suddenly felt taller, stronger than I had in years. The weight of their cruelty, which had stooped my shoulders for so long, had vanished, replaced by the unassailable power of the truth. I looked at them all, these people who had tried to reduce me to nothing, to a glitch, to a smell they needed to erase with air freshener. "My answer is no," Chloe gasped, a genuine sharp intake of breath. The lawyer looked like he'd been struck. Ethan just stared, his face a hollow mask of disbelief. "And not out of spite," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that filled the room. "Though God knows you've earned it. The answer is no because my body, my very flesh and blood, is the last thing you have not colonized. It is the last piece of me you have not tried to consume. You took my home. You took my money. You took my past and tried to take my future. You took my dignity, but you will not have my kidney. It is not a spare part for a family that is built on a foundation of secrets and rot." I let my gaze settle on Ethan, the man I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had cleaned, whose nightmares I had soothed, whose life I had built alongside my own. The love I'd felt for him had been the central pillar of my existence for over 40 years. Now I felt nothing but a cold, vast emptiness where it used to be. "And since we are sharing family secrets today, Ethan," I said, my voice quiet, intimate, and utterly ruinous, "we should share them all." He flinched, as if anticipating another blow. He had no idea. "Richard wasn't just your father," I said, looking directly into his eyes, seeing the confused, broken man-child he had become. "He was your only biological parent." The air left the room. For a moment, I think his brain simply refused to process the words. He shook his head slowly, a tiny, jerky movement. "What? What are you talking about?" "You are the product of one of his affairs, Ethan. Your biological mother died giving birth to you. Richard came to me with a baby in his arms and a confession that shattered my world. I could have left. I should have left. But I looked at you, a tiny, motherless infant, and I made a choice. I chose to stay. I chose to love you. I chose to be your mother." I watched his entire identity crumble. It happened in his eyes first. The foundation of his whole life, his name, his lineage, his relationship to me, turned to dust in an instant. He wasn't the son of Ava and Richard Miller. He was the son of Richard Miller and a nameless, faceless woman. He was the living embodiment of the same infidelity that was now killing his wife. I looked at him, at this stranger sitting across the table, the man who had relegated me to a damp cellar, the man who had stood by while his daughter mocked me for the entertainment of strangers, the man who now demanded a part of my body as his right. "I loved you," I said, and the past tense of the verb was the final, fatal cut. I loved you more than anything. But that love died. It died somewhere in the cold and the damp of that basement. It died with every plate of leftovers and every can of air freshener. It died with every video Chloe posted. It died right here, in this room, when you tried to trade my life for yours. I picked up my old leather bag. It felt light now. "You are not my son," I said, the words precise, clear, and irrevocable. "And I am not your mother. You have no claim on me, not by blood, not by law, and certainly not by love." I turned and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the wreckage. I could feel it behind me, the shattered man, the horrified girl, the impotent lawyer, and the silent, weeping face on the screen. I closed the heavy door behind me, and the click of the latch was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a cage opening. It was the sound of me, finally, walking free. The silence in the 2 days that followed was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the basement, heavy with unspoken contempt. This was the quiet of a held breath, of a decision made. Maria, my lawyer, had a gaze as steady and unyielding as a lighthouse beam. When she placed the papers in front of me, my hand didn't shake. The pen felt light, an instrument of finality. Each signature was a careful, deliberate stroke, not of anger, but of severance. I was cutting a cord that should have been cut long ago, a toxic umbilical that had nourished only them. 2 days later, the papers were served. It wasn't a dramatic, televised confrontation. It was a quiet, legal fact, delivered in an envelope. Ethan was now officially being sued, not just for the $800,000 that had bought the house he called his own, but for the years of methodical dismantling of my life, financial abuse, emotional distress. Maria's voice was calm on the phone when she told me about the exhibits. Exhibit A, she called it, with a touch of grim satisfaction. The Grandma Glitches series, Chloe's own cruel archive, her digital monument to our family's sickness, was now the prosecution's star witness. Each clip of me fumbling with a phone, each staged video of me nodding off in a chair, was presented as evidence of a sustained campaign of humiliation. The internet, once Chloe's kingdom, became her pillory. The story didn't just leak, it erupted. Maria had framed it perfectly, a narrative of quiet dignity pushed to its breaking point. #justice. For Ava trended for days. The same platform Chloe had used to mock me became a global courtroom, and the verdict was unanimous. Her sponsorships vanished overnight. Her comment sections, once filled with fawning praise, became a torrent of disgust. Her carefully constructed brand, the bubbly, relatable girl next door, evaporated in a firestorm of public revulsion. I never watched a single video or read a single comment. Maria told me bits and pieces, but I felt strangely detached, as if hearing about a family I vaguely knew from a long time ago. Their downfall wasn't my victory. It was simply the bill coming due for a debt they had been running up for years. I won. The word felt hollow, too small for the tectonic shift it represented. The court's decision was swift and decisive. The house was to be sold. The proceeds, after the mortgage was cleared, were to be returned to me, along with damages. I didn't attend the final hearing. There was nothing left to say. Instead, a week later, I drove to that street, the one I had once believed was the start of my family's future. I parked across the road, my car a silent, anonymous bubble. I watched as a man in a polo shirt hammered a "for sale" sign into the manicured lawn. The red and white of the sign was jarring against the perfect green grass Ethan was always so proud of. The house looked smaller. Stripped of the laughter and the arguments and the suffocating presence of their lives, it was just wood and glass and stone, a monument to a terrible mistake. I watched for a long time, not feeling triumph, not feeling rage, just a vast, quiet emptiness that was slowly, very slowly, beginning to feel like peace. They were left with nothing but the echoes in those empty rooms, their carefully guarded secrets, and the pervasive public shame that now clung to their name like a second skin. That was a prison of their own making. I simply turned the key in the ignition and drove away, the house shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was gone completely. I am back in Carmel by the sea. The air here tastes of salt and freedom. I didn't buy a large house. I didn't need one. I bought a small studio, a simple box of a room, but it has one magnificent feature, a large wall-sized window that looks out over the Pacific. The ocean is a constant, shifting presence, its roar a lullaby, its endless horizon a promise. The scent of turpentine has replaced the smell of Sarah's cloying air freshener. For the first few weeks, I just sat. I watched the waves. I watched the fog roll in and burn off. Then one morning, I set up my old easel. I stretched a fresh white canvas, and I began to paint again. The first strokes were hesitant, stiff with disuse. But then something broke free. Color exploded onto the canvas. Cobalt blues, fiery oranges, defiant yellows. It was chaotic and messy and vibrant and alive. The other day, a letter arrived. A simple, thin envelope with my name written in a youthful, slightly messy script. It was from Leo, my grandson. I opened it with careful fingers. It wasn't long, just a few lines. A simple, handwritten apology for his part in it all, for the times he saw and said nothing. He hoped I was okay. He was sorry. I felt a single, hot tear trace a path down my cheek. I didn't wipe it away. I let it fall, a small, salty acknowledgement of a wound that was finally beginning to heal. Then, I placed the letter on a small wooden table by the window. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't read it again. I turned back to my canvas, to the wild, beautiful splash of color I was creating. My life, mine. They wanted my kidney. They spoke of it as if it were a spare part in a machine they owned, a final asset to be liquidated. They believed it was theirs for the taking, a biological inheritance they were owed, but they never understood the nature of my true inheritance. It wasn't the $800,000 from Richard's life insurance, or the genetic quirk that made my body a perfect match for his bloodline's disease. My real inheritance, the only thing of true value Richard ever left me, was the strength I found in his betrayal. It was the realization that my worth was not determined by my utility to others. My true inheritance was my freedom, and that was never for sale.